Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to October Nights. This is the first episode that we're doing as a podcast, per se, and I'm doing that for a very particular reason. I'm working on a bigger episode that's a little bit larger, a little bit more in-depth, and I had to actually go back and do some reshoots on it. So these podcast versions are a little bit easier to edit because I'm not worried about footage and color correcting and all that nonsense. I just kind of edit the audio, I pop it into some software, it renders it out for me, and then I'm good to go. Tonight, we're continuing our coverage through horror movies in October, as we talk about the 2020 film, The Empty Man. Now, The Empty Man was written for the screen and directed by David Prio, who I wasn't super familiar with prior to this film, but he makes a pretty good movie here. And while I don't love everything about it, and it might be a little bit long, I think my opinion is mostly positive about this movie. There are a couple nitpicks and particular things that later in the episode I'll dive into spoilers and talk about, but for the most part, I think that generally, if you've watched the previous couple episodes, I think you're probably gonna like this movie. I just think I'm in the minority here where it didn't work for me. And it wasn't because I was bringing a bad energy to it, I just genuinely didn't vibe with this movie as much as I wanted to. So let's briefly talk about the plot here for this movie, The Empty Man. It is based on a comic book series by Cullen Bunn, who I actually have never read a single comic book by, and it was one of the things that surprised me when I booted up the film to see a comic book studio prominently featured in the opening logos. So that was a huge surprise, but luckily, and I say luckily, and I don't mean to take a dump all over comic book movies, this doesn't feel like a comic book movie per se, because I think, at least not Marvel or DC movies, but some of the more independent type comic book series have been adapted to the screen. Those tend to be maybe the weaker of the comic book movies that are coming out now. Not to say that Marvel and DC don't have their weak installments, but they at least tend to be consistent. So if you like Marvel movies, you enjoy pretty much all of them. If you like DC movies, you enjoy pretty much all of them. I was surprised by that, but I do think if comic book movies aren't your jam, don't worry, this doesn't feel like one. It has its very own sense of style and storytelling, and largely it feels like a detective movie that has been infected with a horror movie. Now, the cold open conveys pretty clearly, I think, this is a horror film, which I'm fine with because it sets up the world and sets up kind of the vibe of the film. Though I would argue that the cold open is a bit misleading for the tone overall. Mostly, this is a mystery, and whether or not it's satisfying, I think, is entirely dependent upon whether or not you're able to unpack it before it gets unpacked for you, or you vibe with the kind of story it's telling. It really is a shot in the dark as to whether or not the mystery will work for you. I think it does, and it doesn't work for me. I don't want to give the wrong impression. I do think this is a well-made movie. It's shot exceptionally well by Anastas and Mikos, the cinematographer here. The score is also very well done from both Brian Williams, who writes here as Lustmord, and Christopher Young. And it's very clear that David Prio has a very exceptional vision for what this film can be in the world of this film. He composes his story beats exceptionally well, and the production design here is also to die for. I do think the main performances are also very good, but our main character here is played by James Badge Dale, a man by the name of James Lasombra, who used to be a cop, but due to personal tragedy is now mostly a loner. And all of his days tend to look about the same, working at a local shop that specializes in security, until he gets a call from an old family friend, Nora Quayle, whose daughter is missing. This comes only a day or so after recently seeing the daughter in his backyard and having a brief conversation that, to say the least, is very unsettling and sets up some of the major themes for what the film will explore later on. But let's backtrack a bit. Let's talk about the cold open here. This is kind of a short horror film attached to the larger movie. And for a while, it doesn't really make sense to be there until later on when it's revealed this is the main function of the film. We get a group of hikers who we don't really know and barely get time to know because, surprise, surprise, we're in a horror movie, they're the first to go. And they hike up a mountain only to have one of the hikers fall into a pit and discover an insidious cave filled with a pile of bones on a throne. But his friends pull him out anyway. They find a local shack and stay in there for the night, but things quickly get even worse. The man who fell into the cave becomes a shell of himself, only muttering to himself and not really engaging with the rest of the group. Until one day the group wakes up to find that he has fled up the mountain. They quickly follow him, only to find him standing in front of a bridge, and that's when everything goes horribly wrong. Every one of the hikers ends up dead, all except for one. With the cold open out of the way, the film begins in earnest, and we're exposed to our main character, James Lasombra, for the first time, on a run, and then on a lone outing at a local restaurant. It's at this point that we kind of get the vibe that this guy is a pretty big loner and doesn't really have any family to speak of. It's why he works at a local security store, and why he lives in a house all by himself. Though that doesn't stop him from being haunted by the memory of someone asking, "Where were you?" and memory of something happening to the rest of his family, the young boy and his wife. One day when Lasombra comes home, he finds the child of one of his friends hanging out in his backyard. This is Amanda Quayle, and she has some very cryptic information to pass on to him. Something that sounds straight out of a cult. But before long, she has to go. And that seems like it was just a weird conversation until she disappears, along with several of her friends. With the police unwilling to really help because they think that this girl is only trying to punish her mother, Lasombra pretty much takes up the case by himself and heads off to look for the missing girl. It's at this point that we finally find out that the Empty Man might be the cause behind this. The Empty Man is a child's rhyme, an old folklore legend that if you find yourself on a bridge, you pick up an empty bottle and you blow into it, and the Empty Man will come for you. As the tagline states, the first night you hear him, the second night you see him, the third night he finds you. As Lasombra dives deeper into the case, it turns out that the Empty Man may be way more real than he bargained for. He may be getting closer to the truth, but he's also getting closer to something that might destroy him. Well, that's the basic plot, I guess, in the most ominous way I can possibly deliver it. So let's talk about why I wanted to select this film. Because you might not remember this film coming out last year, and there's probably a reason for that. If the mouse was trying to absolutely bury this film and make sure that no one ever saw it, well, I think they did a great job. Because this is one of the last films that was made under the original 20th Century Fox label before it was bought out by Disney. Shot in a combination of South Africa and Middle America, specifically Illinois and Missouri. This is a film that has a pretty big scope and tries pretty hard to do something very interesting, and I think, if it had been seen by more people, would probably be more liked. In fact, The Empty Man currently holds a 75% critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes. That's not half bad for a horror film, especially a horror film as underseen as this one. And as David Prio's first real directorial outing, it's immensely impressive. And it's kind of sad that it was so absolutely mishandled in terms of release. In fact, Disney did the absolute bare minimum by putting it into theaters in October of 2020, when pretty much no one was going to the cinemas and most of them were closed. It opened on so few screens and opened to so little money that it was deemed a financial failure. In fact, as it stands right now, this film has yet to receive a physical release. Currently, it is only available through digital providers and HBO Max. To be frank, it's not super easy to access, and even worse, it's marketed so poorly that you probably don't even know about it. And it's why I wanted to put it on this list. But it's also pretty different from the rest of the movies that we're going to cover here on October Nights. And there's a lot to love here. There's even a scene that kind of is a perfect encapsulation of Giallo films, with a mass killer coming into a bath where a nude woman is laying and stabbing her to death with a golden knife. It's kind of a homage that almost comes out of nowhere and is never really replicated later on, but to be fair, it's really the last of the major killings in this film that have to happen. But like I said, this film is a visual stunner to look at. The production design helps that a lot too. And the cast is amazing. They know the assignment. The real question is whether or not you will vibe with the particular style of storytelling that David Prio is working with here, and whether or not the mystery is compelling enough to keep you until the end. That I can't answer, at least for you. And so we come to the end of this video, because if you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly recommend stopping the video and going to check it out for yourself, because we're about to dive into spoiler territory. Do yourself a favor, don't watch the rest of this video if you haven't seen it. Go check it out and form your own opinion before you come back and watch the rest of this video. But thank you for tuning in regardless, and with that, we're gonna dive into spoilers, specifically on the ending. I do think this film does a great job at building dread throughout, and especially when it seems like we're mostly investigating a cult that actually has a basis with a supernatural entity. It's genuinely compelling, and some of the darker stuff that just feels like a grounded cult thing is super cool. Particularly, there's one scene where Lasombra is out at a couple cabins in the woods, and there's a scare that is really effective where a bunch of cult members find him and begin to chase him. It's a brilliant and clever use of lighting and camera staging, and it's so cool, and will definitely be the moment that I think sticks with me the most from this entire film. But if I'm to be honest, I think this film doesn't really stick the landing. And that's sad, because overall I do think this is a really good movie that deserved a better, marketing job done for it, and deserved more eyes to see it. And frankly, I still believe that. I think I'm kind of in the minority here, but I want to cover this film because I don't want to pretend like I like every movie I see, and I didn't want to, throw it off the list and pick only movies that I like on this video series. The whole idea is to expand my horizons when it comes to horror, not continue to just watch the same old thing over and over again. And I do think I've done that this far. So let's talk the ending. Because the ending reveals that our main character, James Lasombra, is a creation of the cult. He's not a real person. And this is kind of alluded to in that very first conversation I was mentioning earlier with the young Quail daughter, and further reflected in a conversation with the leader of said cult. And while all of this is compelling, I do think making our main character the titular empty man kind of makes a lot of the stuff lose its luster in retrospect. And I don't fault David Prio for that, because remember, this is an adaptation of a comic book. And while this may have landed really hard and really well in a comic, this doesn't feel like a very cinematic ending. And to be fair, I'm not against downer endings. I actually support them a lot in horror, but I don't think it works here. Effectively, this cult just manifested a human being into real life, and reality just kind of folded him into existence. And while this is an interesting idea, and I don't entirely hate it, I do hate that it's the main character. Sure, we have an unreliable narrator since we're kind of focused in the perspective of James Lasombra, but at the same time, it devalues a lot of the experiences we've seen up until this point. And that actually might be the point, but that doesn't make it satisfying. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong there, but for me, it didn't land like I think the director and the rest of the crew wanted it to. And that's sad, because I wanted to like this movie. I went in with high expectations because I'd heard good things about it, and I'd heard that it was definitely something to check out because it was so underseen. And it's why I'm not telling you to not watch it. In fact, I'm encouraging you to watch it because it actually might be something that you really enjoy. And I think there's a lot of stuff here for everybody, because it's a slow burn. It takes its time, but it does a lot of really creepy atmospheric stuff exceptionally well. And maybe the ending won't work for you like it did for me, but maybe you actually get a lot out of this ending. I should say that the reason that the cult manifested an entire human person out of nothing was because they need a vessel in order to communicate with this otherworldly creature, this supernatural entity that we see at the beginning of the movie. What the kids in the legend call the Empty Man. But this cult refers to La Sombra as the Empty Man because they're just going to put him in a coma and allow him to be nothing but an empty vessel in order to be like an antenna, a way to communicate with this entity. Which, if they had been, I think, doing a better job at foreshadowing throughout the rest of the film, this would have been an incredibly dark moment, I think akin to the ending of Seven, where the dread builds and it slowly dawns on you what's happening, as opposed to you find out at the exact same time that the character does, like 3 minutes before the film ends. That's, I think, my biggest qualm. Like, sure, maybe this ending could have worked, but in its current format, it did not work for me. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy the rest of the film and I won't return to it and maybe reshape my opinion, but as of right now, having just finished the film, it didn't work for me. And it's sad because I really enjoyed like 3/4 of this movie, and the ending is what didn't stick. And usually I'm an advocate to be like, you know what, as long as I enjoyed the journey, it's worth it. And I still mostly believe that. But in this particular case, I think they undermined some of the potential here to adapt very cleanly to the original comic book. And you know what? Maybe an outlier, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I really don't know. But the design of these videos is to tell you honestly how I feel, even if that is a negative feeling. And I don't like doing negative videos on these movies. I really don't. But like I said, I want to be honest with you guys, and that is the function of these. But regardless, I do hope you check this film out. Tell me your own opinion on it. Do so in the comments below. I'd love to have a conversation with you if you love this movie, if you absolutely hated it. But if you check it out because of this video, please let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Regardless, thank you for watching and listening to this episode of October Nights. I hope you continue with us on this journey. Regardless, thank you for joining us for October Nights. I've been your host and curator for this show, Patrick Smith, and I've only got one thing more to say to you. Sweet dreams.